I used to believe that if you lay the foundation quietly enough, build the walls strong enough, and ask for nothing in return, the people you love will naturally respect the structure you created. I was wrong. On a freezing, rain-slicked Thursday evening in October, my wife of 11 years told me to leave our renovated brownstone on Chestnut Street. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She said it with the calm, practiced authority of an executive delivering a quarterly termination notice, exactly 42 minutes after signing a $45 million buyout deal with Sterling Peak Holdings. She stood in the entry hall with a crystal glass in her hand. Beside her was Julian Vance, her managing partner, a man whose tailored suits cost more than my first car and whose smile never quite reached his eyes. His arm was placed casually across the small of her back. Not a colleague's gesture, not a friend's gesture, a owner's gesture. She looked at me as if I were a piece of worn furniture that no longer fit the room's new design. What she didn't know, what Julian didn't know, and what no one in that high-ceilinged room understood, was that the contract they were celebrating, the deal that was supposed to make her untouchable, had passed through my hands for weeks earlier. I had audited every clause, stress-tested every asset valuation, and personally signed off on the final risk assessment under a corporate entity she didn't even know existed. Her greatest triumph was built entirely on my quiet labor, and she was stepping over me to claim it. Psychologists call this functional invisibility. It occurs when one person's support is so steady, so seamless, and so free of ego that the other person stops seeing it as work altogether. It becomes like the air in the room, essential for breathing, but completely uncredited until the supply gets cut off. The autumn air in Philadelphia has a way of clinging to you. It isn't just cold. It's a heavy, wet chill that seeps through the wool of your coat and stays in your bones. I remember the morning of that final day with a strange, pristine clarity. 5:30 a.m. The rain was tapping a steady, rhythmic pattern against the kitchen window. I stood by the counter, waiting for the espresso machine to heat up. It had a tiny hairline fracture along the water reservoir, a defect I'd meant to repair for months but kept setting aside. I stared at that tiny crack, feeling a quiet, heavy affection for it. It was proof of years lived in the same space, of routines repeated until they became second nature. For 12 years, my official title was Senior Network Analyst at a regional utility company. Reliable work, predictable hours, good benefits. But what my wife, Evelyn, had long stopped asking about was the secondary firm I had built over the last 7 years, Vanguard Advisory Group. It was registered under my uncle's estate, a modest corporate vehicle I had initially formed to handle private infrastructure consulting. In the beginning, it was just weekend work, small municipal reviews, and local compliance checks. But as the years went on, Vanguard grew. It became a silent powerhouse, managing due diligence, risk modeling, and corporate forensics for major private equity firms across 3 states. I kept it quiet, not out of deceit, but out of necessity. Years ago, early in our marriage, when Evelyn's firm was just 3 people in a sublet office with mismatched chairs, I tried to share my outside projects with her family. Her father, a retired appellate judge who measured human worth strictly by titles and country club memberships, dismissed my work over a Sunday dinner as a cute little hobby. He advised me to stick to my day job so Evelyn wouldn't have to worry about the mortgage. Evelyn hadn't defended me that night. She had simply passed the salad bowl and changed the subject. From that evening forward, I stopped sharing. I let them believe I was just the quiet technician who fixed the home Wi-Fi, handled the taxes, and made sure the cars were serviced on time. When a person is constantly reminded that their value is conditional, they usually do one of 2 things. They break under the weight of it, or they build quietly in the dark. I built. When I walked into the brownstone that Thursday, I expected the house to be empty. Evelyn's signing was scheduled for the top floor of the Comcast Center downtown. But as I opened the heavy oak front door, I heard the sharp pop of a champagne cork and the sound of low, intimacy-laden laughter coming from the parlor. Evelyn was wearing her emerald silk jacket, the one she wore whenever she needed to project absolute authority. She looked striking, vibrant, and completely filled with the electrical energy of a major victory. Then I saw Julian. He was leaning against the marble fireplace, swirling a glass of amber scotch, watching her with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed every piece of the board was moving exactly as he commanded. When Evelyn saw me, the laughter died instantly. Her face didn't register guilt. It registered annoyance. The subtle, tightening strain of someone whose seamless narrative has just been interrupted by an inconvenient extra. "Corey," she said, her voice dropping into that flat, measured cadence she used for difficult staff members. "I didn't expect you back until late." I set my briefcase on the bench by the door. I congratulated her on the deal. I meant it, despite everything. I had spent 7 years watching her sacrifice her sleep, her health, and her peace for that company. She didn't thank me. She simply crossed her arms, setting her glass on the mantelpiece. I noticed her left hand then. Her ring finger was bare. The platinum band was gone. "We need to end this," she said. "I've already spoken with counsel. The papers are prepared. I'd appreciate it if you could gather your personal items tonight. Julian has arranged a suite for you at the Logan for the next few days until you find something permanent." Julian didn't say a word. He just offered a small, patronizing nod. The look a doctor gives a patient when delivering a diagnosis that requires immediate compliance. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled my leather duffel bag from the upper shelf. My hands were completely steady. When shock hits deeply enough, it acts like a freeze frame, locking your nervous system in place so your brain can process the raw data without the interference of panic. As I reached into the back of the closet shelf to retrieve a box of old personal records, my hand brushed against a thick paper folder tucked behind an archive box. It was a legal pocket folder from a prominent family law firm downtown. I pulled it out. On the inner cover, written in Evelyn's sharp, slanted handwriting, was a date from 14 months ago. Beside the date was a bulleted list. 1. Establish separate holding accounts for intellectual property. 2. Finalize valuation with Sterling Peak before initiating separation. 3. Structure asset division to limit Corey's claim based on non-contribution to corporate growth. 14 months. While I was waking up at 5 a.m. to drive her to the airport for out-of-town roadshows, while I was sitting at her father's dinner table taking silent insults, while I was managing her firm's technical back end without taking a dime in salary, she was meeting with lawyers, drafting strategies to ensure I walked away with as little as possible. Dehumanizing rationalization is a psychological shield. When someone decides to do something deeply unjust to a partner, they must first rewrite the partner's history. They convince themselves the other person is incompetent, lazy, or useless, because if the person is useless, taking everything from them isn't cruelty. It's just clean housekeeping. I folded the document carefully, slid it into the side pocket of my duffel bag, and zipped it shut. I walked downstairs. I didn't look at Julian. I didn't look at Evelyn. I opened the heavy front door, stepped out into the dark, wet October evening, and shut the door behind me with a soft, definitive click. I stood on the damp sidewalk for a long moment, listening to the rain fall through the yellow ginkgo leaves overhead. The streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt in long, blurred streaks of orange. I took one long, deep breath of the freezing air, let it clear the fog from my chest, and whispered a single truth to the empty street. She has no idea what she just set in motion. If you were standing on that sidewalk, holding a bag with 14 months of calculated betrayal sitting in your pocket, would you have turned back around and demanded an explanation right then? Or would you have walked away in silence, knowing that the real reckoning is never emotional, it's strategic? Let me know in the comments if you think silence in that moment was weakness or absolute control, because what happened 36 hours later shifted the balance of power entirely. My uncle, Thomas, lives in a quiet, gray-shingled house near the Schuylkill River in West Philadelphia. The house smells of old paper, pipe tobacco, and cedar. Thomas is a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years calculating load tolerances for bridges. He understands how structures hold weight, and more importantly, he understands how they fail when the internal support gives out. When I arrived at his door with my bag, he didn't ask what happened. He simply opened the door, took my bag, and poured 2 glasses of neat rye whiskey. We sat in his study under the warm, dim light of a brass desk lamp. I laid out the folder from Evelyn's closet on the coffee table. He read through the notes slowly, adjusting his glasses, his face completely unreadable. When he finished, he set the paper down, leaned back, and looked at me over the rims of his spectacles. "A bridge never collapses from the wind, Corey," he said softly. It collapses because the hidden pins rust away while everyone is looking at the paint job. They think you were just the paint. He paused, taking a slow sip from his glass, before leaning forward again. There's something you need to know, he continued. 3 weeks ago, a private investigator came to my administrative office in Harrisburg. He was asking questions about Vanguard Advisory. He wanted to know if you were a shareholder, if you received distributions, or if the firm had any undisclosed assets tied to Evelyn's company. I told him Vanguard was a private trust and walked him out the door. But he wasn't guessing, Corey. Someone gave him Vanguard's tax registration code. I sat frozen in the chair. 3 weeks ago. That meant while Evelyn was presenting a calm, loving face at home, her team was actively trying to uncover my private business, searching for leverage to use against me in court before I even knew a battle was happening. They weren't just ending a marriage, they were executing a preemptive strike. In legal strategy, this is known as asymmetric containment. The goal is to isolate the target, block their financial resources, and create so much psychological pressure that they sign whatever settlement is placed in front of them out of pure exhaustion. That night, I stayed up in Thomas's spare room. I opened my laptop and began pulling records from the secure server at Vanguard. I didn't feel anger. Anger is erratic. It wastes energy and clouds judgment. What I felt was a cold, crystal-clear focus. As I went through the archival logs, my eyes caught an automated notification sent to my system 6 months prior. Vanguard had been retained by Sterling Peak Holdings, the massive investment group buying Evelyn's firm, to conduct an independent forensic review of Evelyn's primary revenue accounts. The engagement had come through Sterling Peak's senior partner, a meticulous man named Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton didn't trust the inflated valuation figures provided by Julian Vance. He wanted Vanguard to verify whether Evelyn's key clients were secured by long-term contracts or held together by informal promises. I had personally written that audit report 3 weeks ago under my corporate title, C.T. Vance, using my middle name. I had verified that the revenue was legitimate, but I had also flagged 3 major operational vulnerabilities in Julian Vance's risk management protocol. Vulnerabilities that could freeze the entire $45 million payout if disclosed to the regulatory board. I had approved the acquisition because the core business was sound, but I had attached a mandatory compliance condition that Julian Vance was required to sign before the funds would clear escrow. Julian hadn't read the fine print of my compliance directive. He had been so blinded by the $45 million figure that he signed the conditional approval without realizing that Vanguard held absolute oversight authority over the escrow release for 90 days post-closing. I closed my laptop at 3 a.m. The rain had stopped. The night was vast, dark, and perfectly silent. I realized then that I didn't need to fight Evelyn in a divorce court. I didn't need to hire aggressive attorneys or make scene-causing calls. The mechanism of control was already in my hands. I just had to decide how far to turn the key. At 8:15 the following morning, my phone rang. An unfamiliar downtown number. "Mr. Thompson?" A crisp, authoritative voice asked. "This is Arthur Pendleton's office at Sterling Peak Holdings. Mr. Pendleton requests your presence for a confidential meeting at the Union League Club at 11 o'clock. The private dining room at the Union League was lined with dark mahogany paneling and oil paintings of 19th-century industrial leaders. Arthur Pendleton sat at a long walnut table, dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit. Beside him was a thick leather binder stamped with the Vanguard seal. "Sit down, Corey," Pendleton said, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. He didn't waste time with small talk. He opened the binder and turned it toward me. "Late yesterday afternoon, our internal compliance monitor received an anonymous package," Pendleton said, his voice measured and quiet. It contained corporate travel records, personal correspondence, and internal communications between Evelyn Thompson and Julian Vance dating back 8 months. He looked at me steadily, his eyes sharp and analytical. "The records indicate that Julian Vance used his position as our retained advisor to manipulate the asset valuation of Evelyn's firm to inflate his own performance fee. Furthermore, the personal relationship between them was deliberately concealed from our board during the final contract negotiations, which constitutes a direct conflict of interest under Section 4 of our acquisition agreement." I looked at the documents on the table. Among them was a printed transcript of a phone conversation between Julian Vance and an offshore broker, recorded 4 weeks earlier. Hearing those words spelled out on white paper didn't hurt. It settled the last remaining shred of doubt in my mind. It was the moment where emotional noise gives way to absolute mathematical clarity. Pendleton reached into his pocket and pulled out a fountain pen, laying it gently beside the binder. As the principal consultant of Vanguard Advisory, Pendleton said, addressing me by my true professional authority for the first time, "You have the absolute legal right under Clause 12B of our retainer to freeze the escrow funds immediately. If you freeze them, Evelyn's company will face an emergency liquidity audit, and Julian Vance will be removed from the board within 48 hours. He leaned back, watching me carefully. Or, Pendleton continued, you can sign off on the override, allow the escrow to clear, and let your personal legal team handle the division through standard divorce proceedings. The choice is entirely yours, Corey. You hold the pen." I looked at the fountain pen resting on the polished mahogany table. Outside the high arched window, the sun was finally breaking through the October clouds, casting long, golden beams of light across the room. If I signed a freeze order, I would destroy Evelyn's firm. I would humiliate Julian Vance, strip him of his reputation, and force Evelyn into a public, costly legal battle that would unravel everything she had built over a decade. It would be total, undeniable victory. I picked up the pen. My hand was cool, steady, and completely unhurried. I looked at Arthur Pendleton and said, "Here is how we are going to handle this." I did not sign the freeze order. Instead, I drafted a mandatory restructuring directive under Vanguard's authority. I required Sterling Peak to execute the buyout, but with 3 non-negotiable conditions. First, Julian Vance was to be immediately terminated from his advisory role for ethical breaches, with his performance fee forfeited entirely to the corporate trust. Second, Evelyn's equity payout was to be placed in an independent, court-supervised escrow account, ensuring full transparency during the marital asset division. Third, Vanguard Advisory would oversee the management transition for 12 months, with complete veto power over all executive appointments. 4 days later, the restructuring order was delivered to Evelyn's office. I was sitting in my uncle's kitchen, drinking hot tea, when my phone screen lit up with Evelyn's name. She called 6 times in 10 minutes. I didn't answer. On the 7th attempt, she sent a single text message, "Please, talk to me." I met her at a quiet cafe near Rittenhouse Square. She looked nothing like the confident, triumphant executive who had stood in our entry hall 4 nights earlier. Her face was pale, her dark hair pulled back loosely, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Julian was gone. Fired by Sterling Peak the previous morning, his corporate reputation ruined across the city. She sat across from me, her hands trembling as she held her coffee cup. "Corey," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever tell me who you were?" I looked at her for a long time. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a deep, quiet pity for a person who had spent her entire life measuring people by their titles, completely blind to the actual weight they carried. "You never asked, Evelyn," I said gently. "You were so busy looking at the title on my card that you never looked at the work in my hands." She covered her face with her hands and began to cry, not with rage, but with the quiet, overwhelming realization of what she had thrown away. The divorce was finalized 5 months later in a quiet, closed courtroom downtown. There were no shouting matches, no public scandals, and no bitter press releases. The division was fair, precise, and completely transparent. I didn't take $1 more than what was right, but I didn't yield an inch of my dignity either. Vanguard Advisory continues to operate from a restored brick building overlooking the river. I still drive my reliable 5-year-old sedan, I still make my own coffee every morning, and I still fix things when they break. Every now and then, when I stand by the window of my office watching the sun set over the Philadelphia skyline, I think about that cold October night on Chestnut Street. Life doesn't demand that you shout to prove your presence. It doesn't require you to wear your strength on your sleeve or prove your worth to people who are determined not to see it. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is to build quietly in the shadows, stay steady through the storm, and let the results speak when the silence finally breaks.